Hi, hello, and welcome, friends. How are you doing? How are you feeling? I'm doing good and feeling good. My name is Faded Alien, your resident chaotically artistic friend, and I am here today with a pretty interesting project. That being said, as you may or may not be able to tell on my wall, I like to every now and then customize little tiny crafts. I know that we normally do our crazy sculptures or our really cool paintings, but every now and then I like to mix up my mediums, and I've been really fascinated by the world of Labubu. And I don't mean I guess I mean in a collector sense, but more so in a customization sense. As y'all know, I'll turn anything and everything into a craft, and these have been no different. That being said, I've been trying to film doing one of these projects for literally months. I got 3 of these, and I would film chunks and bits and like fragments of each of the projects, but I'd never do a completed video. So I guess this is me trying to do an entire start to finish custom Lafufu. So full disclosure, I know what these boxes look like. You may think I got 2 brand new Labubus, but these are actually dupes. That being said, we have 2 in here, well, 1 in each box. And I'm gonna be customizing each one of these. I do just want to do the full little moment for you guys. So here's our bag, tearaway. And then this one definitely looks like a biter. This is another Lafufu. This one is supposed to be, I believe, let's see, he's got pink and yellow. I believe this is Loyalty. So there's 6 on there. I think this is Loyalty. And I do have a plan for this guy. After a couple of days of pondering, I was like, what kind of monster, what kind of creature is yellow? I was inspired to do a complete like face-up modification kind of moment to this Lafufu because I saw a really cool YouTube video by Misfit Makers. I'll do a link in my bio for their video. It was super cool. So I don't have real Labubu money, but I do have Lafufu money. So we got a Lafufu, and we're gonna turn him not into a monster necessarily, but a really cool species of bat. So I figured while we do this tutorial and I show you how we modified this guy and turned him into a bat, I wanted to give some educational tidbits because, as you may or may not know, I have been a vet tech for quite a while and I hyperfixate and love to talk about animals. So let me tell you a little bit about our yellow-nosed bat as we make a yellow-nosed bat Lafufu.
Hello, Audio Alien here. First things first, we need to start with our eyes. So I'm going to go ahead and remove them using a blow dryer to heat up the vinyl and then pop the eyes out of the face of our Lafufu. Now I'm going to use a little bit of some hard kind of cardstock paper. This one is actually watercolor paper. I got this at Five Below, so I highly recommend. And I cut this out. Then I start to trace the eye shapes onto our paper to kind of have a guide. I am saving the other bits of paper because we are going to use that for our bat wings, but I'm going to trace this now to have our general eye shape and then start to fill in our color design. And to be honest, it wasn't all that long before I realized that I needed to strip the eyes so that I can even use the plastic case to make our eye protected, you know what I mean? And I didn't have any rubbing alcohol, so I kind of panicked for a second until I realized that I do have alcohol here, maybe just not sterile, like hospital grade rubbing alcohol. So let me show you how I went ahead and removed that with a cotton swab and a little bit of a shot. So all you need is vodka. With the old design cleaned away after the rubbing alcohol, we're now able to paint our new eyes in, and I wanted to give it an internal glowing kind of look because he's a bat, which is nocturnal, so I wanted to give it like a deep reflect look, so I opted for a raw umber and yellow combination on the center of the eyes, and on the outskirts, instead of having it just white, I put some dragon chrome on it with folk art acrylic paint to give it a little bit of a reflect in the white of the eyes, and I think it turned out really cool. Also, I cannot not forget the glitter. Y'all already know that's a Faded Alien staple. Also, here are our eyes, and they are drying. And it needed to dry for about 24 hours before I went ahead and was able to cut them out and place them back into the Lafufu. But before we do that, we do need to remove the old face up. So I'm going to take some acetone or just nail polish remover on a cotton swab and wipe that through the face, getting off all of the previous smile, the teeth, and the blush marks. With a freshly cleaned face and nice fresh slate for us to go, it is now key time to wrap up our Lafufu and protect the rest of his fur from getting any of our setting spray, paint, glitter, or miscellaneous craft projects all over. This is just to minimize any staining because his fur is super light, and I want to minimize, Labu stains. And all I'm really using is paper towels and tape to just tape everywhere on his face so we can go ahead and start our face up. To start our face up, I went ahead and wanted to make a widow's peak that's very light colored, so I was using a photo of Vegeta and our Honduran Yellow-Nosed Bat to make a widow's peak of a off cream kind of color, and then make our eyeshadow shades, still using my bat eye reference to make some eyeshadow kind of depth towards the sockets, and blushing in the mouth area as well. To accomplish those effects, I am digging into the Morphe 35P palette and sticking more to those taupes and plum shades for the eye socket and the muzzle area of the mouth. At this point, I realized that our bat friend has little grooves on his face, so I went ahead and used little nail rhinestones and glued those to the bottom of his chin to create those little bumpy bat zits. I don't know what those are. These little chin feelies. And after letting them dry to the vinyl, I then went ahead and painted them kind of the base shade and then topped it with a light tip of bright yellow to kind of bring it back to the nose color. Then switching over to the Jaclyn Hill palette volume 2, I focused in on the maroon and black shadows for further into the depth of the eye socket, as well as blushing the split in the muzzle. After all the paintwork that we did, I did decide that Widow's Peak still looked a little plain, so I added some white iridescent glitter to the Widow's Peak just to give it a little more of a pizzazz, you know? Y'all already know I had to add the glitter. We're gonna shake it off in a little bit and then set spray our friend and go from there. Woo! After getting the glitter like 3 hours to dry, I shook off any of the excess and then did our final details and little touch-ups to our face, including the freckle lines and a little more blushing on the cheeks and nose area before I called it done. That being said, it came down to time to place the eyes, and I had a little bit of a complication, so let's kind of get into that. So in the process of trying to put the eyes back on, heating them up, we messed up his face. The setting spray had like heated up and took all of his stuff off, so we're gonna have to repair that now, and then continue with the face up. He still doesn't have a nose yet, so. After taping the eyes to protect them, I was able to kind of color match and replace everything that had been previously smudged by our blow dryer heat displacement incident and repair it from there. Now let's get into sculpting the bat nose. So a couple things we need to know and kind of study on our bat nose is it's very long, very thin, and very segmented, kind of like a leaf. That being said, I did my best with the references that I had and that I'm showing on display here to make a aluminum foil base, and using that with a little bit of super glue, I glued that onto the tip of the Lafufu nose and then used air dry clay to start sculpting our base work and our ground floor for the texturing of our nose. Once the snoot's attached to the face, I go ahead and take Crayola air dry clay and use a very thin sheet of that to kind of coat the initial layer of the nose, and then use a dotting tool for nails and use that to make our tiny little nostril indents, and then use my fingers and a little bit of my paintbrush tips to kind of smooth out the nose and embed any further texture. Because the sculpt was so thin, it took less than 2 hours to dry, and I was able to paint it using the same colors that we did for the chin bits. I will say for the center of the nose, I leaned more towards a corally pink shade instead of that super, super bright yellow because I wanted it to tie back more to the ears as well. The final layer of paint done, I went ahead and set the face using the Krylon matte spray, and I wanted to show you the snoot up close. But now that he's super creepy and looking like the ferryman, it's time to cut him out of his napkin cocoon, see what he looks like, and continue the rest of the glam.
Oh, whoa. Whoa.
Nice.
Now that we have a super creepy cute face, it's time to give him some creepy cute claws. That's right, bats do have super tiny little nails, and I wanted to include this detail, so we're gonna make the world's tiniest mani-pedi. That being said, I am using pre-made press-on nails, and I'm cutting those in half, sizing those with a Dremel and kind of filing them to fit. Then I'm gonna use super glue and attach those to each little finger and start the paint process. I decided to use a crispy autumn orange and a black glitter. Did not like the black glitter, so I opted to keep it that nice orange shade instead. I ended up painting it later. This might be the smallest detail, but it did take me one of the longer times. This took about 3 hours to do just because of how small the pieces are and just because of how delicate they are. It took me a little bit longer than I'd care to admit, but that's okay. We got the job done nonetheless, and I think his claws turned out very, very cute. That being said, I also did the same colors on the toes. I did not add any of the press-on nails to the toes because I feel like those claws look fine if we paint the little triangle marks in. So that being said, let me show you what our cute little nails look like. Oh my god, do you see these tiny little claws and the matching tootsies? How cute. Everything is so fun. He's just missing one thing, and I think I know just what it is. That's right, I'm talking about wings and things, so without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. So I have a couple of references that I used for this, but I did have one photo I found on Pinterest for some bat frames and used that to sketch a basic wire outline for the wings, and I used our construction piece of paper to trace our Lafufu's body to make it easier to map and make them more proportional as well. After being able to map it out with our Lafufu, I was using our pen and just hard marking where I thought the frames would best fit, tracing that over with our bits of fabric. I'm using our pink piece of polyester fabric and a white piece of polyester fabric, and I cut those out into bat wing shapes. Then I'm taking a wire hanger and I'm actually bending that into place, and I'm using 3 different bits of wire hanger, and I'm making 3 mass V's, well, 1 M, 2 little V's. Once I'm done size matching and attaching everything, I'm gonna use electrical tape to kind of tape all of the wire together for the time being, finish cutting out the wings, and now trace over our fabric patterns and continuing to go about that process and treating the fabric before we start to make the permanent frame of the wing.
We have a little frame for our wings. Oh no, it's coming up. We're gonna fix that. Yeah, but it should be pretty size accurate to our Lafufu. Oh my god, y'all, it looks sick. I'm so excited!
With our fabric choices selected and our wing shapes cut, it is now time to dye the polyester. That white polyester needs to be a little more light yellow, so I tried to use food coloring and hot water and salt, and that didn't really take, so I opted to instead dye it using hot water and acrylic paint because polyester bonds a little bit better to that, and that actually worked better than the food dye method. But I am including this because it was a part of the experiment, but I wanted to let you know what actually stuck and made it effective as well. The yellow fabric took a minute to dry, so in the meantime I am going to attach the pink fabric to the frame using a little bit of glass glue Loctite and doing tiny little dribbles, and then applying a little bit of pressure once the glue is applied. I used a pillow underneath my desk to kind of press the fabric into the wire frame and really make sure the edges of the fabric were nice and attached to the wire, just to make sure everything's nice and stable before I started to suture it. But it was a lot of trial and error with just getting the fabric to attach to the wire because, you know, polyester and metal aren't the stickiest things by themselves, so the Loctite worked better than the super glue or the Mod Podge. Once the glue bonded my two materials, I then proceeded to take my needle and thread and hand sew the frame to the wing itself to kind of keep it attached. And I did that for both sides once the light yellow set. So I'm going to repeat the process on the other side. I did not film all of it because it took forever, but I did include us attaching the other side, the yellow part of the wing, with glue because it takes about 6 hours to hand sew everything just because it's tiny and it's nimble, and I did prick my finger a bunch of times, but we lived, we're fine. I also use small bits of leftover fabric to use and cover up any exposed bits of frame and seal it up. Once that's done, you should have something kind of like this, and I am going to complete sewing the other side in a moment, but at the halfway point, our wings are looking really, really nice. Definitely not as thin as the true bat wings. Those are like very tiny skin thin membranes. I wanted to give this one a little more color and vibrancy because he's our little LabuBAT, so playing into the fantasy there. So after about 3 Bob's Burgers episodes, I finished sewing the other half of the wing. Also, question of the day, is there any show that you put on whenever you're doing a long-term art project? If you have a go-to show or maybe album, let me know. I would love to hear it. I also made sure to do a couple extra stitches at the tops of the wings to give it more of a crowned or like thick knobular bend to it. Look at those wings! With all the heavy work of sewing out the way, now we get to do the fun part of painting and doing eyeshadows. So once again, sticking to that Jaclyn Hill palette and our original base colors for our face up, I'm going to be going in between those to add a lot of vibrancy and potency to the band of the wings, which are a very, very honey, buttery kind of yellow. And I'm kind of mixing that in between our as well and getting some of those thicker maroons into the underneath of the bands on the pink side. And a smudge of orange on the tips and the tops of the wing, as well as intensifying some of that deep yellow more towards the bones of the wing, if you will. And all that was left at this point was to sew on the wings and do one extra little detail that I wasn't anticipating doing until I realized we had enough time for it. But sewing the wings, I did decide to start my first stitch at the center of the back through the frame of the wing and kind of work it into loops around that center point of the bat wing. That being said, I looped it at least 8 times and then kind of worked up the rest of the extra thread to go back and forth in little X marks going through the back just to really secure those bat wings into the back and make sure that he doesn't have any accidents later or any slip ups and have the wings come off. That being said, I realized I had enough stuffing and I decided I was gonna make Labu buns. So I found this TikTok on how to sew a little BBL into your Labubu, and I had to try to do it. So I used scissors and I cut around our little frame after I sewed in the extra plushing into the cheeks, and I kind of sewed underneath and on top of it to emphasize the little crack there, and then I cut the fluff shorter underneath to emphasize more of a roundness to the bat buns. That being said, grand reveal for our bat in Thank you so much for watching the entire process. I cannot believe we finally got a Labubu done. I've been meaning to do this tutorial from scratch for frickin' ever, and I think this one turned out really cool. Also, I really hope that you learned at least 1 or 2 cool bat facts on the way. I just think bats deserve a lot more appreciation, and we don't know enough about all the mini bats, except for like the vampire bat, so peep the yellow-nosed Honduran bat and all of his glory and floof. Thank you to everyone who also watched through live on Twitch. If you want to see what I'm doing, we have our Tuesday and Thursday activities on Twitch and our Saturday shenanigans, so definitely come through for that. Once again, thank you everyone for coming through and hopefully having a good time. Remember to stay positive, stay safe, and stay creative. I will see you very, very soon. Bye, friends.